Hello, welcome back to the Rise and Fall of the Chill Out Room, a history of ambient house and ambient techno from 1989 to 1990 something. This is the third and final entry for 1992. Where to start on today's video? I suppose Pete Namlook would be as good a place as any. After starting his music career playing guitar in the new age tinged jazz rock band Romantic Warrior, as well as stints with many other jazz musicians, he was apparently something of a virtuoso. Namlook discovered acid house, and with Frankfurt having somewhat of a bustling dance music scene, began to create his own. Taking influence from the work ethic of jazz, Namlook's music was frequently improvised, stuck to first take where possible, and his rate of production was phenomenal. After a single on Pod Communications under the name Sequential, he started up his label FAX plus 4969/450464, from here on referred to simply as FAX, releasing 9 12-inches in the first 2 months, largely of early trance material, each a collaboration with a different producer, including future longtime friends Uwe Schmidt and Amir Abadi, the latter better known as Dr. Atmo. His second release with Abadi, however, was very, very different. It was the first album to be released on FAX, Silence by Silence. I'll briefly talk about tribal ambient. I always found the name a bit odd. Tribal is such a weird way to describe it. Kind of unpleasant reduction of non-Western culture as being related to primitive culture and tribes, but it's stuck over the years and I'm yet to find a widely used alternative, so tribal ambient it is. Effectively, it's frequently spacey synth music with acoustic percussion, usually in the form of non-Western drums, either performed or sampled. Early adopters of the style included Steve Roach and Robert Rich, and it will become a small but very prolific niche of ambient in the 1990s, with a large number of artists who began in the post-industrial dark ambient world adopting the style, with significant labels including Extreme, Project and Hixon Leonis. Artists such as Vidna Obmana and Matthias Grasso developed cult followings in the 90s, while others, such as Two and Solitaire, had some crossover with the ambient house scene via labels like Beyond and Recycle and Die. Two were one of a few artists who went beyond the percussive side of tribal ambient and played flutes and other foreign instrumentation, while the likes of Jorg Reyes brought their own experience of indigenous cultures to the mix. It's an area of music I've always been fascinated by, but the enormous discographies of the artists and labels involved, as well as the distinct lack of information easily available, this has always been a majorly underground scene, have meant my knowledge remains fairly surface level. Silence is one of a number of FAX projects that plays with tribal ambient. In fact, some Silence material is close enough to that style that if it wasn't made by Namlook and released on FAX, I probably wouldn't have considered including it as part of this series. But such was ambient in the 90s that these distinctions were less obvious and cross-pollination was common. And so here we are, the first Silence album is very much in the Steve Roach, Robert Rich mould of tribal ambient, albeit clearly made by producers versed in dance music. The hi-hats filtered through dubby delay in Omid Hope, for example, clearly have their roots in Roland drum machine programming. The spoken word that appears throughout the album, the voice of silence, as FAX fans frequently call it, is once again something with a touch of ambient house to it, but otherwise it's all lengthy analogue synth drones, 3 tracks running past 20 minutes, 1 to around 10, punctuated by the tribal drums. Namlook treats us to some of his synth soloing, a key FAX sound, and always very slightly naff, while the tribal aspect brings forth images of the deserts of the Middle East and Northern Africa. The stringed instruments of Santur in particular are incredibly evocative. Released on FAX in December 92, Silence is a template for many of the label's future records. The simple circle design on the cover, blue here to denote ambient as opposed to the yellow of dance music, the lack of artist name, reissues and licensed versions, as was usual with FAX, were credited to the artists involved, Pete Namlook and Dr. Atmo here. The usual ridiculous limitation, as this was early days and the label's first album and ambient release, the run of 500 copies is almost excusable as risk management. Reissued on sub-label Ambient World in '99, FAX releases were always one-time pressings. The album was also licensed to Rising High in '93 as part of their burgeoning ambient catalogue, and was later packaged with follow-up Silence 2 as part of a 2-CD package for FAX USA, a sub-label of New York's Instinct Records that released 6 double-disc sets of FAX music in '94 and '95. The Rising High release was a very rare example of a Namlook album being pressed to vinyl. He was notoriously not a fan of the format, only pressing singles to 12-inch because it was expected by DJs, and it was reissued once again as a double LP in 2023 on Silent State Records, the German label currently with the rights to distribute Namlook's work. The Silent State reissues are superb, with the kind of care and quality control one would expect from the passionate fans FAX always attracted. That said, and this is absolutely not the forum to do so, but I'm going to do it anyway, if anyone from Silent State is listening, I implore you to get some international distribution. The label seems to pride itself on selling all its own stock, but with shipping costs what they are in 2024 and importing from Europe post-Brexit an absolute nightmare, the label's latest releases work out at around £65 to get in the UK, which is sadly a financial impossibility for many of us at this point. I'd love to own more of these records, but the label seems to be making it ridiculously difficult to do so for anyone outside of the EU other than the incredibly well off. Anyway, rant over. FAX continued to release trance and techno 12 inches for some time afterwards, but Silence really was the start of the label as it's widely remembered, and it's as good a starting point as one could hope. To this day it remains one of the label's most well-loved releases. Another artist operating on the fringes of different scenes, Barry Craig released his second album as A Produce in 1992. With shorter tracks and lush, welcoming beds of melodic synths, Reflect Like a Mirror, Respond Like an Echo feels more closely aligned with records like Silence than that of other tribal-leaning artists. With occasional bursts of spoken word and field recordings, there's a subtle collage feel, while pieces like Clear Pools, Native Pulse and the title track are simply utterly beautiful and come recommended to anyone into any kind of ambient. Craig's work would only improve for his next record, but this album is a worthwhile listen for fans of the more organic end of the genre. On the topic of tribal-leaning artists, I'll briefly touch on Muslimgauze. The late departed Bryn Jones was, and remains, a controversial figure, his music almost singularly focused on the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Making this video in 2024, more than 40 years after Muslimgauze started, that feels depressingly more relevant than ever. There are far better places for a discussion of Palestine than a series about ambient house music, but Jones's outspoken nature on the issue has made it a controversial issue, and some prefer to avoid his music as a result. This does make exploration of his catalogue even more daunting than its size alone, and frankly I tend to associate him more with the post-industrial tribal ambient scene anyway. That said, as with many artists, there is much crossover, and for this series I will highlight one album, 1992's Zul'm, on what was arguably his most supportive label at the time, Extreme. With a mixture of Middle Eastern and Indian instrumentation, admirably performed by native musicians rather than merely sampled, and electronics, synths and drum machine rhythms, the album, one of Jones's first professional studio sessions, is among his most accessible, most laid back and most atmospheric. The eerie Tehran via train is a particular highlight, blending field recordings and drones with staggered percussion into a wonderfully visceral soundscape. For anyone interested in exploring the world of Muslimgauze from the perspective of 90s ambient, I'd definitely recommend Zul'm as a good jumping off point, with his other albums on Extreme to follow. On the polar opposite end of things to Bryn Jones's heavily political, somewhat anti-sample approach to tribal electronic music is Deep Forest, a French duo whose use of vocal snippets from various traditional cultures around the world also met with controversy even back in the 90s. They have since become the poster child for accusations of cultural appropriation, in part due to how cheap and novelty the approach to incorporation of these sounds seem. I believe that John Hassell's fourth world music concept has a lot of validity, and use of what are variously called tribal, ethnic or world music elements can be blended with Western styles in respectful and artistically valid manners. However, the cultural tourism approach is frankly a bit patronising, and the samples on Deep Forest albums really do feel like they've just been brought in to help the producers seem exotic and worldly, without any thought or purpose. It's effectively primitivist caricature based on the belief that art from other cultures has value based on its novelty and exoticism rather than intrinsic artistic worth in its own right. The group's donations to charities aiming to conserve Aboriginal cultures, albeit none of whom featured in any way on their albums, does really suggest the pair were very well-meaning but just a bit ignorant. The lack of payment given to copyright holders of the samples, however, doesn't help their side. Deep Forest were, however, hugely successful with their first two albums, with a Grammy nomination and a win in the Best World Music Album category, and this helped make them prime targets for ire over their approach. Why am I mentioning them? Well, if you're able to strip the music away from its context, most of their self-titled album is still pretty fucking cheesy and shallow. It makes Enigma sound like Aphex Twin, frankly. But Sweet Lullaby is a stunner. The original mix with its down-tempo breaks is lovely, the beatless ambient mix at the end of the debut album is better. Gorgeous melancholic synths with a haunting chant based on a recording of a lullaby from the Solomon Islands, the original field recording has such a stunning melody, and honestly the electronics and additional vocals here really do complement it as a piece of music. I don't really do guilty pleasures as a concept, but I suppose this is kind of one. Maybe the only artist who managed to straddle both the world ethno-fusion and ambient house, ambient techno approaches properly was Banco de Gaia. Introduced earlier via the Ambient Dub Volume 1 compilation, Toby Marks' project is one of few acts from the era to be active through to today, and although I've never really gotten into his music myself, he deserves some coverage here. Marks began with 3 self-released cassettes in 1992. While CD was becoming affordable for some DIY artists, tape, with its links to the experimental underground in the 80s, was still a more lucrative option. And while long out of print, only briefly reissued on CDR a decade label, all 3 can be found quite easily online. Medium opens up with one of the silliest uses of sampling in the whole ambient house scene, a track that makes the orb seem po-faced. Sampling everything from the original Star Trek opening titles and the theme from The Twilight Zone to the organ melody from Procol Harum's A Whiter Shade of Pale, all placed over a fairly rave-friendly slice of upbeat dance music, the Final Frontier borderlines novelty overall. Marks' sound is relatively underdeveloped at this point overall, with plenty of 80s sounding synth presets and drums. Honestly, there are tracks here which aren't far off some of the schlock turned out by past-it Berlin School artists on labels like Private Music and Innovative Communications at the same time, and it's mostly the samples that make the track stand out among a lot of other electronic music from the time. That said, tracks like Tempera show a very keen ear for melodic composition, while Mavich Aribi gives a good idea of the incorporation of ethnic elements that would define Marks' sound on his Planet Dog albums. Second tape, Freeform, Flutes and Fading Tibetans is an immediate improvement with an atmospheric down-tempo opener, the dubby field recording drenched Desert Wind. Overall, the album moves away from the more hardcore-oriented debut towards a mixture of mellow trance and dub, although Therapy's jazzy soloing does induce a bit of cringe. Later on, Terra Om and Theta introduce a beatless ambient side to Banco de Gaia's sound. While clearly the sound of a still developing artist, Freeform, Flutes and Fading Tibetans is a massive leap up in quality. A November gig at Club Dog was recorded and released as Deep Live, the final of the 3 tapes. Unsurprisingly not as high quality sound as the studio albums, the performance does suggest further refining of the Banco sound with smoother incorporation of the various elements into a more cohesive sound. Toby Marks was soon signed to Planet Dog, although it would take until 1994 for his proper debut to see the light of day. Sven Väth. Probably the most enduring figure in German dance music, Väth has been a key player when it comes to both DJing and production since the late 80s through to today. His vinyl-only DJ sets, often running to 10 or more hours, have become legendary, and he's championed countless acclaimed artists over the years. Not to be limited to one genre, however, he has flirted with ambient. While I'm hesitant to discuss albums of the 8 dance tracks bookended by 2 beatless ones mould in a series about ambient music, Sven Väth's debut Accident in Paradise is a rare example of one that does fit. Despite it being largely a mix of early trance and techno, most tracks here have been clearly created with atmosphere and imagery in mind. Indeed, in some ways I'd say Accident in Paradise fits closer to Eno's 82 definition of ambient than some of the down-tempo and beatless records I've discussed so far. With its incorporation of flutes, sitar and didgeridoo into repetitive beats, Opener Ritual of Life's psychedelic nature is probably closer to what might be considered actual tribal ambient than most examples of tribal ambient, with the layers of percussion giving the piece a ritual nature. The whole album is effectively a collaboration with Väth's IQ Records co-owner Ralph Hildenbutel, himself the owner of Recycle or Die, and undoubtedly he brings a lot of the ambient edge. The beatless, emotive Caravan of Emotions and the down-tempo L'Esperanza could easily come from a Recycle or Die release. In its second half, the record takes some bizarre turns into baroque harpsichord and flute music, overlaid with gurgling water, discordant circus music, full-blooded trance and sinister drone, suggesting a keenness to experiment even if the results are occasionally jarring or downright bad. It makes for a somewhat disjointed, incohesive record, but one that had lots to offer 90s ambient fans. Elsewhere in the world of dance artists incorporating elements of ambient into their records, there are a fair few notable mentions. Repetitive Digital Noise was the second album by Uwe Schmidt, released on Pod Communications in '92. Schmidt will go on to release a lot of music. His Atom TM Audio Archive Bandcamp page is currently up to number 204, a lot of it on FAX, especially on his own FAX sub-label, rather interesting. While best known for his acid and techno-Latin crossovers, Schmidt has created a fair amount of more atmospheric music over the years, starting here. Repetitive Digital Noise, his first release under the I alias, is mostly repetitive minimal acid, somewhat comparable with FAX and Air Liquide, but it does feature the surprisingly eerie LTB-CYB, standing for Let the Beat Control Your Body, although apparently not sampling to Unlimited, as well as a collaboration with Tetsu Inoue, a lot more on whom later. Despite having aimed right at the charts with the pop dance stadium house aping singles Ebenezer Good and Love Sex Intelligence, parent album Boss Drum still showed the Shamen could find time for something more ambient, such as the gorgeous Scientas with its running water, life-affirmingly uplifting synth pads and Hillage-esque guitar soloing, and the mellow techno of Re-Evolution, featuring an essay by Terence McKenna. The latter would go on to be remixed into a tabla-driven ambient track by FSOL the following year. Psychic Warriors of Gaia were a bit of an oddity in the early 90s techno scene. The spelling of their name showed a clear debt to Psychic TV, two of them were members of the Temple of Psychic Youth, and their mix of progressive techno structures, tribal rhythms and atmospheric textures feels a little ahead of its time. Yet they're not name-dropped or cited anywhere near as often as one would expect, and their discography is relatively small. Probably most widely remembered for their excellent remix of Orbital's Lush 3, they nevertheless produced some notable music, starting with a 1992 single, Obsidian. The organically decomposed version, Deconstructure, opens with a lengthy spell of beatless, hypnotic arpeggiation, field recordings and spooky synth pads, only heading into techno for the final few minutes of its 20-minute runtime. With its ever-evolving subtle repetition and murmured vocal samples, it feels like a very sinister cousin to The Orb's Loving You. Accompanying album of Biospheres and Sacred Grooves starts more beat-forward, but soon brings down the tempo for the slow, tribal drums of Linkage and the mellow ambient techno of Obsidian. It's a world away from chill-out rooms of ambient house, but of Biospheres and Sacred Grooves will hold a lot of appeal for fans of the odder, darker artists of the era like FSOL and Biosphere. Plenty of other records from '92 contained a track or two of note. Cosmic Baby's debut album Solstice is a fairly typical slice of 1992 European dance music, blending acid, trance and techno, but features a run of around 30 minutes of largely beatless music in the middle, even if it relies far too heavily on obvious synth presets. Library music producer Alex Gray's ambient dance set is a surprisingly reasonable collection of anonymous but decently composed down-tempo and beatless synth tracks which, although not directly composed for use on TV, they do have that slightly box-ticking feel in places. Dance pop group Opus 3 included some ambient pieces on their debut album, such as Flow and Stars in My Pocket. Transact Hypnopedia created a convincing soundscape for the title track of their Spectral EP. Future psytrance stars Astralasia managed a superb dark ambient piece, The Deep, and a spacey epic, Turn of the Tide, on their album The Politics of Ecstasy, even if Glass Trap Reprise falls too close to Shocky New Age for comfort. Sisterlove's The Hypnotist features a gorgeous ambient remix on its B-side, apparently a favourite of Mixmaster Morris at the time. As 1992 drew to a close, ambient was on the cusp of exploding, with a #1 album from The Orb, debuts from Aphex Twin, The Irresistible Force, Earth to Infinity and Pete Namlook, and the launch of labels and series like FAX, Beyond and Artificial Intelligence, this form of music was no longer the playground of a small number of artists and DJs, but was proving to have life of its own, and new names were popping up all over the place. That said, nothing could have prepared listeners for 1993. Up to this point I've been covering both classic albums and ambient adjacent works which were significant for the expansion and growth of the genre. With 1993 there'll be more albums to cover than a sensible person would attempt. I am of course not a sensible person. And so many of these ambient remixes and interesting one-offs will fall by the wayside. With more than 100 different albums and the first appearance of a couple of key labels, 1993 is the year where ambient truly exploded. I would love to hear what you think of the music I covered in today's video, and there are also subscribe, like and share buttons down there which you might feel like pressing. And I'll see you next time.